So I just got done watching an episode of the Club 520 podcast. That is the podcast hosted by Jeff Teague, and he had Draymond Green on as a guest. And they spoke about two players in particular that I found very interesting because they're two players that are on the complete opposite side of the spectrum. Gilbert Arenas and Carmelo Anthony. The conversation was centered around peaks and longevity and who was better at their peak. Not those guys in particular, but just going through players, right? You guys should go watch that podcast. It was a very good podcast. But they were more speaking about that player's individual game, right? They brought up a Carmelo versus Jason Tatum one-on-one scenario. I don't think a lot of people are picking Jason Tatum in that equation, right? But at the end of their careers, Jason Tatum is going to be highly regarded as a better player than Carmelo. I just think he will. His resume will speak to that. And they brought up Gilbert Arenas, and they were saying how if Gilbert's prime was a little bit longer, we might look at him like he's one of the best ever. But they were still talking about in terms of like game, like real hooper stuff, that conversation. But in the case of Carmelo, he has the longevity, top 10 scoring all time. So that actually might make us overrate his prime, his peak a little bit, just a little bit, right? And in the case of Gilbert Arenas, where it only lasted 3-4 years, we might not remember how good he was amongst his peers. So that got me thinking about the conversation, peak versus longevity and how we should rate certain players. Now, I'm gonna bring up Damian Lillard, and I'm not a Dame hater, but I always push back on Dame as this all-time great because the resume to me doesn't scream that. If you're a Dame fan, I understand it. Dame is an amazing player, right? But I bring up Dame because Dame at this point has longevity. Dame has been here, I believe next year will be year 13 for Dame. And Dame made the top 75 players list of all time. And that was, what year did that happen? That happened 3 years ago, and Dame went on to have his best statistical season after that year. So I didn't believe Dame should be on that team. But a guy like T-Mac doesn't have the longevity of a Dame, but I feel like 90, maybe 95% of people would agree that T-Mac at his peak was better than Dame. Am I wrong? I feel like most people agree with that. So what's the actual line when longevity becomes more important than peak? Because I feel like that line right there is a great line. And Dame being over T-Mac in the top 75 to me is crossing that line. And that's not even mentioning Dwight Howard, but I'm gonna leave the Dame situation alone. Dame is amazing. Not an anti-Dame video, right? But now I want to go back and look at some players that didn't have a long enough peak for us to remember how great they actually were in comparison to their peers. And obviously T-Mac is a great example of that, but another one I feel like is Chris Webber, right? We always think of the early 2000s as the golden age of the power forward because it was, but it's always Tim Duncan, Kevin Garnett, and Dirk in some order, right? But there was another guy in there, and that was Chris Webber. Now, Chris Webber was the oldest of the three. He is 5 years older than Dirk and 3 years older than Tim Duncan and KG. But if we look at these 5 years from Chris Webber, about a 5-year peak, you can honestly argue was longer, but I want to count the Sacramento days where he was going head-to-head with Tim Duncan, KG, Dirk, Kobe, Shaq. If we look at his stats over those 5 years in comparison to Tim Duncan and Kevin Garnett, he is right there with those guys. And it's not just numbers on a bad team. The Kings were consistently at the top of the conference, and if you stack up their wins by years with the Spurs, they are right there every single year with the Spurs. Now, you're probably seeing that and wondering, why did the Spurs get all the championships and not the Kings? I will point you to my latest video about the unluckiest teams in NBA history, where there will be an explanation for why that Kings team never got it done. But to me, Chris Webber is the epitome of what we're talking about. He's someone that was damn near a borderline Hall of Famer who at his peak was going head-to-head with Tim Duncan and Kevin Garnett. Oh, and took the Kobe and Shaq Lakers to 7 games without their second best player for majority of that series. But again, if you guys want more about that, go watch that latest video. And while yes, Chris Webber was the oldest one of the group, so you might assume that he just fell off earlier, and to a certain extent that's true, but even Dirk, he didn't win his ring until he was 32 years old. Kevin Garnett didn't win his ring until he was 31 years old. At 30, Chris Webber tore his ACL and was never the same player. But moving on to another guy that is a Hall of Famer again, but he was kind of on the borderline, but during his peak, he was one of those guys, and I'm talking about Chris Mullin. Chris Mullin is actually a pretty famous name because of the Run TMC Warriors, and I'd say he had about a 5-year peak, which makes sense because he was a 5-time All-Star and 4-time All-NBA. And why he's a 4-time All-NBA and not a 5-time is because he got hurt during that last All-Star season, where he tore a ligament in his right thumb, but luckily for him, he was a left-handed shooter. And next year he came back, was a little bit worse, and he ended up getting hurt again that next year with a knee injury, and from that point on, he would struggle to stay healthy. Now, he ended up having 2 relatively healthy years, or very healthy years, His last year with the Warriors, he played 79 games, averaged 14 points per game. In his first year with the Pacers, played 82 games where he averaged 11 points per game. But obviously we're talking about a different player at this point in his career. But that 5-year peak, he averaged 25 points, and I really want to round up to 26 for him. But 25 points, 5 boards, 4 assists, 2 steals, 52% from the field, 35% from 3, and 87% from the free throw line. Those are damn near Kevin Durant numbers. 52% from the field as a small forward while taking a bunch of jumpers. Now, when I say a bunch of jumpers, you got to think about the times, right? He only took 2 threes a game during this prime run I'm talking about. But during this last year of his prime that I'm talking about, he was in the middle of one of the most efficient scoring seasons in NBA history, averaging 26 points, shooting 51% from the field and 45% from 3. Now, I don't know this off the top of my head, but I'm gonna guess that Steph Curry is the only other player to do that. And I don't know if you'd want to give that to Chris Mullin because he only played 46 games, but 46 games, 45% from 3 is still extremely impressive. And the actual list of people to do it is Steph Curry, Chris Mullin, Dale Ellis, and I guess Kiki Vandeweghe will consider it. You know, we'll give him that, but he only took like 1 3 a game. Chris Mullin took 3 a game, and Dale Ellis actually did it while taking 4 threes a game. So Dale Ellis should really be on this list about peaks, but he never got the All-NBA nods to really have a conversation. But he shot 47, nearly 48% from 3 while taking 4 threes a game, and he averaged 27 points this year. A crazy year. But I really just wanted to talk about those guys, Chris Webber, Chris Mullin, T-Mac. You know, we could do this all day. We could talk about Grant Hill. You know, how high should he be rated? Another 5-time All-NBA guy, another guy where his prime lasted, his peak lasted about 5-6 years. And it was actually the year, at least statistically, the year it looked like he was about to enter his prime where he got hurt, where he went from 21 points per game to 25 points per game, and he gets hurt at the end of that season, and he's never the same player. To me, that's a little bit different than the guys I'm talking about, because the guys I'm talking about really got to realize their full potential. It was just cut short. And I hope I'm making that distinction clear. Grant Hill is more like a what if, right? There's no what if about Chris Mullin or T-Mac or Chris Webber, right? We know exactly what they were. Grant Hill, we don't know what he could have been. Penny Hardaway, we have no idea what he could have been. Derrick Rose, even though he won an MVP, he never got to actually see his prime. So I hope you guys understand that distinction I'm making. And it's hard to make a definitive statement about who was in their prime and who wasn't going to get better, who wasn't going to make a leap, because you never actually know. But I think of guys like DeMarcus Cousins and John Wall, guys that were Hall of Fame level players, but they're not going to make the Hall of Fame. And I don't know which category do they fit in the Derrick Rose, or do they fit in the Chris Webber, right? They're somewhere in between, kind of like Grant Hill, somewhere in between. Or someone like Brandon Roy, obviously that fits more the Penny Hardaway, Derrick Rose conversation, right? And even worse for him because his career just completely stopped. But I hope you guys understood the point of this video. And we could talk about a couple other names that fit that criteria, just rapid fire real quick. Blake Griffin, Yao Ming, Amar'e Stoudemire. And really, Amar'e Stoudemire and Blake Griffin are perfect names for what I'm talking about. If Amar'e was able to keep it going for 3 or 4 more years, we talk about him completely different. If we don't count the year he got hurt, Amar'e Stoudemire was an all-star for 6 straight years. And he probably would have been All-NBA for 6 straight years, but he got hurt in one of those all-star years, only playing 53 games. In 5 of these 7 years that I'm talking about, the 5 years he was healthy, he was top 10 in MVP voting 4 times. And Blake and Amar'e are very similar when you look at Amar'e's first year in New York compared to Blake's first year with Detroit. It looked like those guys were about to have a second prime and really evolve as players, and they both got hurt. And, you know, the rest is history. But that's where we're going to leave off the video. I'm sure there are dozens of names you guys can bring up in the comments to let me know. Players that were like elite in their peak, and it can't be players that like were a flash in the pan. That's the thing. That's why it's a difficult discussion. It can't be a 1-year, 2-year thing. It has to be someone that is still highly regarded, right? Still a Hall of Famer, a borderline Hall of Famer, but their peak was like top of the league peak, not, you know, borderline Hall of Famer peak, if that makes any sense. So I know there's really no resolution to it. There's really no right or wrong answer. You know, I made the Dame T-Mac comparison, but there's no right or wrong answer. I just find it to be a very fascinating basketball discussion. So I know you guys know a bunch of names that will probably fit this criteria, so let me know in the comments down below. And thank you guys so much for watching. Please drop a like, please comment, please subscribe. I'm out. Peace.